Cedarville was the kind of town where nothing extraordinary ever happened. With just over 3,000 residents, life moved at a slow pace, keeping time with the sound of the creek running through the main square and the lazy chirping of crickets at sunset. The town's tiny airport was really just a landing strip surrounded by a rusty hangar and a makeshift office. That's where Brian worked, a young mechanic with a shy smile and calloused hands, who spent his days fixing up old single-engine planes used for flight lessons and crop dusting. Brian had always dreamed of flying. Ever since he was a kid, he'd draw airplanes in his school notebooks and watch the few takeoffs and landings with wide, shining eyes. But life in Cedarville was tough, and opportunities were few and far between. Becoming a pilot seemed like a distant, almost unreachable dream. That Saturday morning, the sky was absurdly blue, and Brian was finishing tightening a stubborn bolt on the engine of an old Piper when he heard an unusual noise. He looked up, squinting against the sun, and saw a pink speck tearing across the sky, getting closer to the strip. "What the heck is that?" he muttered, getting up with his hands still covered in grease. The few townsfolk walking along the dirt road stopped to look too. It wasn't every day that a private jet, especially one painted sparkling pink, showed up around here. With a somewhat clumsy landing, the little jet hit the ground, kicking up a cloud of dust. Brian ran out to the runway, joined by Jack, the old airport manager, who scratched his head in total disbelief. The jet's door opened slowly, and out stepped a tall, elegant woman wearing huge sunglasses and a designer purse slung over her shoulder. Her high heels sank into the soft dirt of the runway, and she visibly grimaced before trying to steady herself. "Can someone give me a hand here?" Ashley said, taking off her glasses and revealing striking blue eyes that looked around the tiny airport like she'd landed on another planet. Brian, still greasy and completely lost for words, just nodded and walked up to her. "Your plane wasn't really supposed to land here," he said, his voice a little rough. Ashley crossed her arms. "Trust me, it wasn't in my plans. The panel just went dead all of a sudden. It was either land here or crash into a cornfield." Jack let out a whistle. "Well, miss, looks like your little jet's gonna be grounded for quite a while." Ashley glanced around, looking utterly dismayed. This is it?" she asked. Brian smiled and shrugged. "Welcome to Cedarville." She let out a deep sigh, kicked off her high heels, and stood barefoot on the hot runway. Brian couldn't help but notice. She looked completely out of place here, and absolutely stunning. And in that instant, without either of them knowing it, something way bigger than a broken plane had just landed in Cedarville. Ashley followed Brian to the little hangar, trying to balance herself on the uneven dirt. Each step made the fine dust cling to her bare feet, and she didn't bother hiding her look of disgust. "This place is absolutely primitive," she muttered, glancing around like she'd stepped onto the set of an old movie. Brian awkwardly opened the hangar door and let her walk in first. The place was simple. A few scattered tools, 2 half-assembled planes, and a makeshift desk covered with crumpled papers and technical sketches. The air smelled like oil, and a hot breeze drifted through a broken window. Ashley stopped in the middle of the hangar, clearly trying to find a clean spot to lean on. "Where's the lounge?" she asked, looking around. Brian blinked, confused. "Lounge? You know, that waiting room with air conditioning, comfy chairs, flavored water," she said like she was stating the obvious. Brian scratched the back of his neck, not sure if he should laugh or apologize. "Well, we've got a soda machine that sometimes works," he said, pointing to a corner where an old vending machine was making a suspicious noise. Ashley let out a dramatic sigh and rolled her eyes. "Great. Perfect. Just wonderful." Jack, who'd been watching the scene from a distance, let out a small chuckle and wandered off to go take care of some super urgent business on the other side of the runway, leaving Brian all alone to deal with the glamorous outsider. Ashley crossed her arms. "So, how long until you fix my jet?" Brian walked over to the plane still parked on the strip, circled it once, and came back with a serious look on his face. "Well, it's gonna need some new parts, and here in Cedarville, ordering parts isn't exactly fast," he said, sounding almost apologetic. "How long?" she pressed, impatient. 3, maybe 4 days, if you're lucky." Ashley's eyes widened, like he'd just said 3 or 4 years. "I have a huge photo shoot in Los Angeles in 2 days. I can't be stuck here." Brian shrugged. "It's safer to wait. Flying like this would be risky." She ran a hand through her perfectly styled blonde hair and looked up at the sky like she was trying to summon strength. "My phone," she said suddenly. "I need service." Brian hesitated before answering. "Yeah, about that." He pointed toward a dented sign by the hangar entrance that read, "No signal zone." Ashley stared at him like he'd just delivered the worst news of her life. "No signal? You've got to be kidding me." "Welcome back to Cedarville," Brian said with a small, contained smile. She huffed, grabbed her designer bag and stormed off barefoot in the opposite direction, kicking up dust and muttering under her breath. Brian watched her walk away, shaking his head with a mix of pity and amusement. "This is going to be interesting," he murmured to himself before turning back to examine the pink jet, which gleamed under the sun like a lost jewel in the middle of nowhere. Little did Brian know that was just the first of many disastrous encounters, and somehow every little disaster would start bringing them closer and closer. Ashley wandered around the tiny airport grounds, desperately trying to find a cell signal. Nothing, not even one bar, not a hint of Wi-Fi, just endless blue sky and the lazy buzz of insects. After a few minutes and a few muttered curses blending desperation and disbelief, she made her way back to the hangar, where Brian was wiping down an engine part with a grimy rag. "Is there a decent hotel around here?" she asked, crossing her arms. Brian glanced over his shoulder at her and tried to keep a straight face. "Depends on what you mean by decent." Ashley raised an eyebrow, already bracing for the worst. "We've got the Cedar Inn. 3 rooms, breakfast, and if you ask real nice, Miss Carroll might fry up some extra bacon for you." Ashley blinked slowly, like she was trying to process that information. "Any resorts?" she asked, holding onto a sliver of hope. Brian laughed. "This is Cedarville's version of a resort." Ashley let out a dramatic sigh, clearly struggling to accept her new reality. "Can you take me there?" Brian hesitated. He still had work to do in the hangar, but he didn't feel right leaving her alone. She looked about as lost as a fish out of water. "Sure. Let me just grab the truck," he said, dropping his tools. Brian's old noisy pickup, a Ford from decades ago, shook and rattled with every bump on the dirt road. Ashley gripped the torn seat, trying hard not to show her panic. "Does this thing even have airbags?" she asked, tense. Brian shot her an amused look. "Depends. Do you count my hands as airbags?" Ashley let out a little laugh despite herself. Maybe, just maybe. The grease-stained mechanic wasn't so bad after all. The drive into town was short but showed just how simple Cedarville really was. Old houses with big porches, kids running barefoot in the streets, small shops with hand-painted signs. Everything looked frozen in time, and totally foreign to Ashley's world. They pulled up in front of a simple white wooden building with a crooked sign that read, "Cedar Inn," hanging over the porch. Before she could go inside, Ashley yanked her phone out of her designer bag and tried again. Still nothing. Brian hopped out of the truck and walked around to open the passenger door for her. She hesitated for a second, surprised by the gesture. "Chivalry's still alive in Cedarville, huh?" she said, stepping down carefully. Brian smiled shyly. "We don't have a lot to offer, but good manners are free." Ashley looked at him a little longer than she meant to. There was something disarming about the way he spoke. No pretense, no hidden agenda. Miss Carroll, a short and energetic older lady, appeared on the porch, wiping her hands on a floral apron. "Hey there, Brian!" she waved excitedly. Then she spotted Ashley, and her eyes went wide. "Goodness gracious, is that a celebrity?" Ashley flashed her automatic smile, the one she'd perfected at hundreds of events. "Ashley Collins. Nice to meet you." Miss Carroll rushed over and gave her a big hug, leaving Ashley completely thrown off. "Welcome, sweetheart. You're gonna love Cedarville. We've got the best carrot cake in the whole state." Ashley gave an awkward smile as she was practically dragged into the inn. Brian leaned back against his truck, shaking his head with a small, amused grin. Ashley might have been desperate to get out of there, but she had no idea Cedarville, and maybe someone she hadn't really gotten to know yet, were about to change her life forever. Ashley settled into the tiny room at the Cedar Inn, looking around with a mix of despair and disbelief. The walls were covered in floral wallpaper, the bed was topped with a crocheted quilt, and the ceiling fan made a rhythmic noise that, under different circumstances, might have felt cozy. To her, it was just another reminder she was stuck in the middle of nowhere. Letting out a deep sigh, she dropped her suitcase on the floor, a designer suitcase that looked completely out of place in that simple room, and flopped onto the bed, sinking into the reality that, no matter how much she complained, there was nothing she could do until the jet was fixed. The next morning, after a restless, frustrating night, Ashley decided to head downstairs for breakfast. In the inn's small dining room, Miss Carroll had set out a generous spread: cornbread, homemade jam, scrambled eggs, and, of course, the famous carrot cake. The smell was comforting, and even though she hated to admit it, Ashley's stomach growled. While she tried to decide between the bitter coffee and the orange juice, she heard Brian's old truck pulling up outside. She peeked through the window and saw him hopping out, adjusting the faded canvas cap on his head. He looked just as out of place in her world as she did in his. And yet there was something oddly comforting about the way he moved, so easygoing and unbothered. Miss Carroll caught Ashley watching and smiled. "Brian's a good boy, hard-working, honest," she said, filling Ashley's glass with juice without even asking. Ashley blushed slightly and looked away. "Just curious. He still lives here? In such a small place?" Miss Carroll laughed. "Not everyone dreams of running off to the big cities, sweetheart. Sometimes people find what they need right where they are." Ashley didn't answer. She grabbed her juice and stepped out onto the porch, where the morning sun was already shining bright. Brian climbed the porch steps a few minutes later, wiping his hands on a cotton rag. "Mornin', Princess," he said with a crooked smile. Ashley raised an eyebrow. "Princess?" "Well, a woman with a pink jet, high heels, and a designer bag. What else am I supposed to think?" She huffed, but there was a playful sparkle in her eyes. "And you?" she shot back. "A mechanic who still believes in happy endings? Sounds kinda ironic." Brian leaned against the porch railing and looked out toward the horizon, where the golden hills were starting to warm up under the sun. "Life's too short not to believe," he said simply. Ashley fell silent, caught off guard by the unexpectedly deep answer. "Came to pick you up," Brian went on, changing the subject. "I'll need your help to speed up the parts order for your jet." She frowned. "My help? I don't know a thing about airplanes." Brian shrugged. "Not everything's about understanding. Sometimes it's just about being part of it." Ashley stared at him a little longer than she meant to. There was a sincerity about him that she rarely saw in the people she usually hung around with. Without saying anything else, she stepped down from the porch and followed him to the truck, barefoot again since her heels had sunk hopelessly into the dirt the day before. As the truck rattled down the dirt road, Ashley stole a glance at Brian, who kept his eyes on the road, a peaceful look on his face. And for the first time since she arrived, she wondered if maybe being stuck in Cedarville for a few days wasn't the end of the world. Maybe, just maybe, it could be the beginning of something she never could have planned for, and something no fancy jet in the world could ever buy. The hangar felt even hotter than the day before when Ashley and Brian arrived. The sun beat down hard on the tin roof, filling the place with a stifling heat mixed with the smell of oil and hot metal. Ashley clutched her bag tightly, looking around with an expression like she'd rather be literally anywhere else. "So, what exactly am I supposed to do here?" she asked, eyeing the scattered tools suspiciously. Brian gave a small smile as he bent down to grab a box of parts. "Well, for starters, you're gonna hold this," he said, handing her a clipboard with a list of parts and suppliers. Ashley took the clipboard like it was contaminated. "I work in fashion, not with bolts," she said, wrinkling her nose. Brian chuckled. "Bolts or fashion, at the end of the day, it's all about the details." Ashley couldn't help but smile. He had this weird way of making everything seem a little less terrible. "All right, philosopher mechanic. What do I need to do?" she asked, already relaxing a little. "Just check if the parts are available to order. I'll give you the list and you call the shops," Brian explained, handing her an old cell phone that looked like it belonged in a museum. Ashley's eyes widened. "This is a phone? I thought it was a piece from the town's museum." Brian let out a spontaneous, deep, warm laugh, one that somehow made Ashley's chest feel a little warmer too. "It works," he said, winking. Resigned, Ashley sat down in an old folding chair in the corner of the hangar and started dialing numbers while Brian worked on the pink jet. For a few minutes, a comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the sound of tools clinking and Ashley's short conversations with suppliers. "Did you always dream of being a mechanic?" she asked suddenly while waiting on hold. Brian looked up from under the jet's wing. Nope, I wanted to be a pilot, he answered with a small, slightly bittersweet smile. But it wasn't exactly cheap. So I learned how to take care of other people's planes instead. Ashley bit her lower lip, feeling an unexpected pang of compassion. I could have hired you as my pilot, she joked, trying to lighten the mood. Brian laughed. Princess Ashley, with her pink jet and her personal pilot. It would have been the talk of Cedarville. Ashley laughed too, and this time it was real. A light, easy laugh without the usual tension she carried at events and parties. By mid-afternoon, after hours of frustrating phone calls and stifling heat, Brian suggested a break. Time for a cold one, he said, pulling an old cooler out from under the workbench. He handed her a small glass soda bottle. Ashley accepted it, surprised. Glass soda bottles? She teased. You guys really are vintage around here. Best flavor in the world, Brian said, taking a sip from his own bottle. Ashley hesitated but then tried the soda, and had to admit it was good. Way better than the fancy detox juices and overpriced coffees she usually drank back in Los Angeles. They sat on the edge of the hangar watching the clear sky and the empty airstrip. So tell me, Brian, she said, turning to him. If you could go anywhere right now, where would you go? Brian thought for a moment before answering. Maybe up there, he said, glancing at the sky. I always dreamed of flying. For real. Ashley stayed quiet, soaking in his words. She'd always thought freedom meant having it all. Money, fame, followers. But sitting there, looking at Brian dreaming of something so simple and pure, she started questioning everything she thought was important. Without even realizing it, she smiled. And for the first time since her pink jet had touched the dusty ground of Cedarville, Ashley Collins felt exactly where she was supposed to be. After the soda and the short break, Brian went back to work, laughing to himself as he watched Ashley still balancing the clipboard awkwardly in her hands, trying to stay far away from anything remotely dirty. You sure you don't want to get your hands dirty? He teased, flashing a playful grin. Ashley made a dramatic face like he'd suggested she dive into a mud puddle. I pay my manicurists a fortune not to have to do that, she said, raising her perfectly manicured hands. Brian shrugged, pretending to be serious. Well, if you want to get out of Cedarville before the next solar eclipse, you might want to reconsider. Ashley narrowed her eyes at him. Was that a veiled threat? Just a friendly suggestion, he said, handing her a wrench covered in grease. She hesitated. Her instinct was to refuse, but there was something in Brian's brown eyes, a mix of challenge and amusement that made her rethink it. With a resigned sigh, she took the wrench using just 2 fingers, like it was radioactive. Like this? She asked, trying to hold the heavy tool without letting it touch her clothes. Brian tried hard not to laugh. Perfect, princess. Now hold it tight while I adjust this piece right here. Ashley stepped closer carefully, following his instructions. Brian worked easily with precise and confident movements. Ashley watched his hands, strong, calloused, and for the first time, she realized just how much skill went into what she used to dismiss as mere manual labor. And then, without warning, a drop of grease slipped off the part Brian was adjusting and landed right on Ashley's arm. Ah, she screamed, staring in horror at the black smudge on her arm. Brian's eyes widened. Sorry, I didn't mean to, he said, trying and failing to hide his laughter. Ashley looked at him, then at her arm, then at the grease on the floor. Without thinking too much about it, she dipped 2 fingers into the smudge and swiped a streak of grease right across Brian's cheek. Brian froze for a second, stunned. Ashley covered her mouth, pretending to be shocked. Oops. Didn't mean to, she said with a mischievous smile. Brian burst out laughing, a deep, genuine laugh that echoed through the empty hangar. In response, he grabbed a little bit of grease from his own coveralls and dabbed it lightly on her nose like he was getting her back. Ashley let out a giggle, an easy, carefree, almost childlike sound she hadn't heard from herself in a long time. They stayed like that for a moment, laughing like 2 messy kids who'd forgotten about the whole world around them. You look awful, Ashley said through her laughter, pointing at Brian's grease-smudged face. So do you, he shot back, pointing at the black streak on her nose. Ashley raised her hands in surrender. Truce? She offered, still smiling. Truce, Brian agreed, sticking out his hand. Ashley shook it, and felt a tiny jolt shoot up her arm, like something invisible had just been sealed there. right in the middle of that hot, cluttered hangar. As they looked at each other, still smiling, something shifted in the air between them. A new feeling, subtle but undeniable, started to take shape. Ashley was the first to look away, wiping her hand on her jeans, not really sure how to process what had just happened. Brian just smiled to himself and went back to work, but the lightness in his chest told him that, no matter how small it seemed, something had definitely begun to change. Something not even Greece or a pink jet, or all of Ashley Collins's fame could stop. By late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the golden hills of Cedarville, the work in the hangar finally slowed down. The warm breeze blowing in through the open doors carried the smell of freshly cut grass and burnt oil. Ashley, sweaty and still sporting faint grease marks on her face, plopped down on one of the toolboxes, swinging her legs, tired but strangely satisfied. Brian turned off the air compressor and pulled off his cap, running a hand through his messy hair. "Bet you didn't think you'd be spending your Saturday like this, huh?" he teased. Ashley smiled, grabbing a water bottle. "I figured I'd be at a spa with a clay mask and a foot massage," she said playfully. "But this is memorable too in a weird way." Brian laughed and, on impulse, dragged an old crate over near her. "Want to see something?" he asked, a different kind of sparkle in his eyes. Ashley frowned, curious. "What?" He opened the crate, revealing a stack of worn notebooks with battered covers and yellowed pages. Ashley leaned closer, peering inside. "What's this?" "My drawings," Brian answered, looking a little embarrassed. She picked up one of the notebooks and opened it, surprised to find sketches of all kinds of airplanes. Small ones, big ones, modern, vintage. Each line was drawn with precision and passion. "You drew all of this?" she asked, slowly flipping through the pages. "Since I was a kid," he said, looking at the notebooks with a mix of pride and sadness. "It was my way of dreaming when I couldn't fly for real." Ashley stayed quiet, taking in the depth of those words. She ran her fingers over one particularly beautiful drawing, an old airplane soaring above a golden field. In the corner of the page, there was a small signature, B. Miller, 2008. "You've got real talent, Brian," she said, surprising even herself with how sincere she sounded. Brian shrugged, a little uncomfortable with the compliment. "Dreaming doesn't pay the bills," he said lightly. But there was something heavier underneath. Ashley closed the notebook slowly. "Sometimes it's exactly what keeps us alive," she said, looking straight at him. For a moment, the outside world, the small town, the broken jet, the lives they'd both put on hold, just disappeared. It was just the two of them. In the middle of the hangar, surrounded by hand-drawn dreams and silent promises, Brian was the first to look away, clearing his throat. "Better put this away before we get grease all over it," he said, carefully tucking the notebooks back into the crate. Ashley smiled, but her heart was beating a little faster than before. Seeing Brian like this, so real, so human, stirred something inside her, something all the luxury, fame, and spotlight had never touched. She stood up from the toolbox, brushing dust off her jeans. "You know, Brian, sometimes we think we need wings to fly, but maybe all we really need," she hesitated, looking at him, "is courage." Brian lifted his eyes, surprised at how deep her words were. Ashley just smiled, shrugged, and walked toward the hangar doors. "Tomorrow, same time?" she asked, already heading out. "Tomorrow, same time," he replied, watching her disappear into the golden light of late afternoon. And as her silhouette faded into the distance, Brian knew deep down that this wasn't just another day in Cedarville. It was the beginning of something he would have never dared to sketch. The next day, the sky was clear again, and the heat started to settle over Cedarville early in the morning. Ashley showed up at the hangar wearing denim shorts, a simple t-shirt, and sandals. No high heels, no designer bags. She herself probably wouldn't have recognized this version of her if she could have seen herself from the outside. Brian, already sweating under the pink jet, lifted his head and smiled when he saw her. "Who are you and what have you done with the princess?" he joked, wiping his face with a rag. Ashley shrugged, giving him an easy smile. "Let's just say, I'm adapting." She handed him 2 cups of coffee she'd brought from the inn, a simple gesture that pulled a genuine smile from Brian. "Bet you like your coffee strong like a brick," she said. "If you can't build a house with the spoon, it's not real coffee," he replied, accepting the cup. As they worked together, The conversation flowed naturally, effortlessly, like the past few days had built an invisible bridge between two worlds that once seemed totally incompatible. During one of their breaks, sitting again in the shade of the hangar, Ashley stared out at the horizon, spinning the coffee cup between her hands. "Did you know I hated being famous?" she said suddenly without looking at him. Brian glanced at her, surprised. "Sure didn't seem like it yesterday when you showed up looking like you walked straight off a magazine cover." Ashley let out a short, bitter laugh. "It's easy to look happy when everyone expects you to." Brian stayed silent, respecting the moment. Ashley took a deep breath before continuing. "When I started, it was just about sharing the things I loved. Fashion, art, photography." She shrugged. "But after a while, it turned into something else. A numbers game, contracts, forced events. You have to smile at people whose names you don't even remember. Post pictures from places you didn't even want to be. Sell a life that's not always really yours." Brian watched her more carefully. Sitting there, without heavy makeup, without the social armor, Ashley looked almost fragile. "Must get lonely," he said simply. Ashley turned to him, surprised. It was the first time someone had so quickly put into words exactly what she felt. "It does. Way more than people think," she admitted, her voice almost a whisper. For a few seconds they just looked at each other. No rush, no need to fill the silence. Brian finally spoke, his voice low. "Maybe. It's time to live for yourself. Not for everyone else." Ashley gave a sad little smile. "Sounds easy when you say it." "Didn't say it was easy," he replied. "But sometimes the best things aren't." Ashley leaned her head back against the hangar wall, closing her eyes for a moment, letting his words sink in. It was strange how, in just a few days, someone she barely knew could see the parts of her she herself tried so hard to hide. There, in that hot, dusty hangar, Ashley felt something shift inside her. Something no luxury trip, $1 million contract, or glamorous photo shoot had ever managed to stir. For the first time in a long time, she wanted to be seen. Really seen. And somehow, in some inexplicable way, Brian saw her. By late afternoon, while Brian was working on the landing gear of the jet, Ashley decided to take a walk around the little airport. The sun was painting everything in shades of warm orange and red, casting a golden glow across the open fields. Near the fence that separated the landing strip from the dirt road, Ashley spotted a little girl with curly hair, no more than 6 or 7 years old, balancing something odd on her back. 2 big wings made out of cardboard, painted silver. Curious, Ashley walked closer. "Hi," she said, smiling. The little girl turned around, her brown eyes shining with excitement. "Hi, are you the lady with the pink airplane?" Ashley let out a soft laugh. "That's me." "I thought you were a fairy," the girl said, flapping her homemade wings. "Nobody here has a pink airplane." Ashley knelt down so she was eye level with the little girl. "I love your wings. They're beautiful," the girl beamed proudly. "I made them myself, so I can fly." Ashley felt a pang in her chest at the purity of those words. "What's your name?" she asked. "Lucy," the little one replied, stretching out her hand. Ashley shook her tiny hand with a smile. "Nice to meet you, Lucy." "I'm Ashley." Lucy looked over at the jet in the distance, then back at Ashley. "Will you take me flying someday?" Ashley hesitated, surprised. "Well, my plane's a little sick right now. But maybe one day when it gets better." Lucy made a thoughtful face, as if seriously considering the offer. "Okay. In the meantime, I'll fly with my cardboard wings," she said, spinning around in place until she tripped and landed on her bottom, letting out a carefree little laugh. Ashley laughed too and helped the girl to her feet. At that moment, Brian appeared, wiping his hands on a rag and watching the scene with a lopsided smile. "I see you've met Miss Lucy," he said. Lucy ran over to Brian and wrapped herself around his leg like she'd known him forever. "Hi, Brian. I was showing my wings to the lady with the jet. Best wings in all of Cedarville, you know that?" he said, ruffling her curly hair. Ashley watched the interaction, feeling her chest tighten with a tenderness that caught her off guard. "Is she your daughter?" she asked, before she could stop herself. Brian smiled. "Oh no, I'm just the neighbor who fixes her backyard swing now and then. Lucy lives with her grandma." Ashley nodded, relaxing without really knowing why. "She's amazing," she said, watching Lucy now running down the open air strip, her cardboard wings flapping clumsily. She is, Brian said, watching the little girl with a look that spoke volumes about who he was. Ashley stayed quiet, taking in the simple, perfect scene. The innocent child, the good-hearted mechanic, the golden evening light. Without warning, Brian turned to her. Want to take a little tour of the town? Show you the best of Cedarville? Ashley smiled. What is that? The grocery store and the ice cream shop? You'll be surprised, he said, winking. Ashley hesitated for a second, and then, for the first time in a long time, said yes to something without knowing exactly what to expect. As they walked toward Brian's old pickup truck, the sunset light wrapped around them, like even the sky itself was cheering them on. And from a distance, Lucy, with her cardboard wings, waved at them, like a little paper fairy who knew that sometimes the most unlikely falls are the ones that teach you how to truly fly. Brian's pickup rumbled up the main street of Cedarville, which honestly was little more than 2 blocks of shops, a park with a fountain that barely worked, and a few old houses with flower-covered porches. Ashley looked out the window, fascinated by how simple everything was. It was so different from anything she knew, and strangely, she didn't feel the usual anxiety that always followed her around in Los Angeles. So, Princess, ready for the VIP tour? Brian teased, pulling up in front of a small cafe with striped awnings. Ashley laughed, brushing her wind-tousled hair back. Let the show begin. Brian hopped out of the truck and once again opened the door for her. Ashley accepted his hand, feeling the comforting warmth of his touch. The cafe was cozy, with wooden tables and the smell of fresh bread in the air. A few people glanced curiously at Ashley, but there were no judgmental stares, no camera flashes, no phones being whipped out. Just genuine, friendly curiosity. They sat at a table near the window. Brian ordered 2 coffees and a slice of apple pie, insisting she had to try it. If you've never had Miss Marge's pie, you haven't really lived, he said, winking. Ashley laughed. Is this pie or some kind of divine revelation? Both, he joked. When the pie arrived, Ashley took her first bite and her eyes went wide. Oh my God. Brian smiled, looking pleased. Told you. They ate while laughing, swapping little stories. Ashley about the weirdness of the fancy galas she used to attend. Brian about the quirky characters who made Cedarville their home. So what else does Cedarville have to offer besides divine cafes? Ashley asked, dabbing her lips with a napkin. Oh, you'll see, he said, standing up and offering his hand. Ashley took his hand without hesitation. Their next stop was the town square, where the old streetlights were starting to flicker on as the sky darkened into shades of purple and blue. In the center of the square, a small wooden gazebo, strung with twinkling lights, served as a stage for local performances. That night, a group of children were rehearsing a community play, their voices blending with the sound of the cicadas. Ashley sat on one of the benches by the square, next to Brian, and watched in silence. There was a peace there, a feeling of belonging, of simplicity, that she hadn't felt in years. It's beautiful, she said, almost without realizing. It's the best we've got, Brian replied, flashing a quiet smile. Ashley turned to look at him, studying his profile under the soft glow of the square's lights. Without even meaning to, she said, You're really different from everyone I know. Brian glanced at her, curious. Different good or different weird? She smiled. Different good. Brian dropped his gaze, shy, and kicked a small pebble across the ground. You're different too, Ashley, he said. Not the way you show the world. The right way. Ashley felt her heart tighten in her chest. It was just a few words, but they carried such pure sincerity that she almost didn't know how to respond. Instead, she just smiled and leaned her shoulder lightly against his, and there they stayed, in silence, watching the children laugh and play while the world seemed to slow down just for them. Maybe Cedarville didn't have skyscrapers or fashion runways, but sitting there, in that simple square under the stars beginning to appear, Ashley felt she was exactly where she was meant to be, and that maybe, for the first time, she was beginning to discover who she really was. Night fell softly over Cedarville, and Brian dropped Ashley off at the inn just like he had the past few days. Before getting out of the truck, she hesitated, and he noticed. Same time tomorrow? He asked, that calm smile on his face, the one she was already starting to associate with feeling safe. Ashley bit her lower lip, an involuntary gesture that betrayed the confusion brewing inside her. Yeah, she answered, though her voice came out softer than she intended. She climbed out of the truck, feeling Brian's gaze follow her as she walked up the steps to the porch. It was only after she closed the door behind her that Ashley leaned against it, taking a deep breath. What was happening to her? She was used to crowds, commitments, running from one event to another under the flashes and expectations, and now she found herself craving something different, something she didn't even know how to name. Cedarville, with its simple streets, soft lights, children laughing in the square, and especially Brian with his honest eyes and shy smile, was stirring parts of her she thought had been buried long ago. Ashley walked over to the small window in her room and looked up at the night sky, where thousands of stars twinkled lazily. There, far from everything she knew, without heavy makeup, without the social masks, she felt more vulnerable than she had ever allowed herself to be, and at the same time freer. But that freedom was terrifying, because it meant letting go of everything she had fought for: fame, success, financial security. It meant, maybe, admitting that what she thought she wanted wasn't what she truly needed. Ashley lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling. She thought about Brian, his lopsided smile, his strong, grease-stained hands, how he actually saw her. She thought about Lucy, with her cardboard wings and her dream of flying. She thought about herself, and how maybe she was carrying invisible wings she had never dared to use. She tossed and turned, restless. What if this feeling wasn't real? What if it was just the charm of a small town, the novelty of something temporary? Ashley squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push the thoughts away, but deep down, she knew. Some things, once they touch your heart, are impossible to ignore. And somehow, without even meaning to, Brian Miller was becoming the exception to every rule she thought governed her life. In the dark, Ashley promised herself she'd be strong, that she'd keep her feet on the ground, that she wouldn't get swept away by fairy tale illusions in the middle of dusty airstrips and broken-down jets. But as she drifted off to sleep, the last image to cross her mind was Brian's calm smile, and the sound of that easy, carefree laugh that somehow already felt like her new favorite song. And maybe, just maybe, it was already too late to turn back. Across town, Brian pulled his pickup into the small lot behind the modest house where he lived. The porch light flickered stubbornly, as if fighting against the warm night breeze. He shut off the engine but stayed there for a few minutes, his hands resting on the wheel, his gaze lost in the darkness. Just a few days ago, his life had been simple: airplane mechanic in a town forgotten by God and by the maps, taking care of wings that belonged to other people's dreams. And now there was Ashley, the girl with the pink jet, who at first he thought would be unbearable. A spoiled, untouchable princess. But every day she showed another side. A woman who laughed genuinely, who really listened, who had sad eyes behind the flashes and the followers. Brian ran a hand over his face, exhausted, but unable to push her image out of his mind. He wasn't stupid. He knew who she was, knew the world she came from, knew better than anyone that he didn't belong in that world. And yet, there was something about her that spoke directly to the part of him that had never stopped dreaming. The part that still believed that maybe, just maybe, there were things, and people, worth the risk. Brian climbed out of the truck and went inside. The living room was simple, with old furniture and books crammed onto a makeshift shelf. On the wall, a single photograph, him and his father, standing in front of a small airplane years ago, before everything fell apart, before dreams became too expensive to keep alive. Brian ran his fingers along the frame, like he was touching a memory. He sat down on the worn-out couch and let his head fall back. He knew that if he let her in, Ashley could get into his life in a way no one else ever had. And he also knew how much that could hurt, because she wasn't from Cedarville. She was made of big cities, magazine covers, million-dollar contracts, and he was just Brian, a mechanic with calloused hands and dreams tucked away in yellowed notebooks. But when he closed his eyes, the last thing he saw was her smiling, grease-streaked face, throwing her head back and laughing in the middle of the hangar. And in that moment, a part of him, the most honest, unguarded part, knew. It didn't matter where she came from. What mattered was how she made him feel. And that wasn't something he could just ignore. Brian opened his eyes and smiled up at the ceiling. Maybe, just maybe, some things were worth the fall, even if the landing was uncertain. The next morning, the heat in Cedarville felt a little gentler. like even the weather knew something was about to change. Ashley showed up at the hangar with a light smile and a spark in her eyes she wasn't bothering to hide anymore. She wore a simple white t-shirt and faded jeans, looking less like a celebrity and more like herself. Brian was already waiting for her, leaning against the truck, arms crossed, smiling in a way that made her stomach twist in the best possible way. "Thought the princess would have run back to the big city by now," he said, half teasing, half hoping. Ashley laughed. "Who says I still won't?" she teased back, though there was no real conviction in her voice. Brian just smiled and opened the hangar door for her. The pink jet still gleamed under the morning sun, but it felt different now. Almost ready, almost fixed, almost ready to leave. Ashley's chest tightened at the sight. While Brian checked the final details on the engine, she walked over to him, stopping just a few inches away. "Brian?" she said, her voice softer than she meant it to be. He looked up, and their eyes met. There, between scattered tools and the smell of oil hanging in the air, the world simply stopped. Ashley took a step closer, feeling her heart hammer against her ribs. Brian dropped the wrench with a dull clatter but didn't even blink. She lifted her hand and lightly touched his face, wiping away an invisible smudge of grease that wasn't really there. The touch was light, almost a caress. Brian caught her hand, his palm warm against hers, and gently pulled her closer. Ashley tilted her face up, and he lowered his. For a moment there was nothing but their uneven breaths and the electric tension crackling between them. Their faces were so close Ashley could count the tiny freckles across Brian's nose. She closed her eyes. He leaned in a little more, and then, "Brian!" a voice shouted from the road. They sprang apart so fast it was like magnets repelling. Ashley stumbled back a step, her face burning. Brian cleared his throat, embarrassed, turning toward the voice. It was Jack, the old airport manager, waving his arms like a madman. "We've got visitors," he yelled, pointing to a fancy pickup truck kicking up dust as it approached. Ashley turned and her eyes widened. On the side of the truck, stamped in shiny gold letters, was the name of a very familiar aviation company. "They're from the company sent to pick up your jet," Jack said, panting. Ashley felt her heart drop to her stomach. Reality hit her like a bucket of ice water. Her jet was fixed. Her life, her packed schedule, her commitments, it was all right there, waiting for her. Brian shoved his hands into his pockets, staring at the ground. Ashley squinted, trying to keep the flood of emotions inside from spilling over. They had almost kissed. Almost. But now that almost felt like a canyon between two completely different worlds. The jet gleamed under the sun. The luxury truck was getting closer, and in the middle of it all, Brian and Ashley stood there, frozen, like two souls who, for one brief and perfect moment, almost had the courage to meet. The black pickup screeched to a stop on the dry dirt. Two men in suits and dark sunglasses hopped out, clipboards in hand, and hurried steps. Ashley stood still for a second, her heart pounding, feeling like she was watching her life resume without her permission. "Miss Collins?" one of the men called, adjusting his glasses. "We're here to take your jet back. Parts replaced, systems checked, she's ready for takeoff." She nodded slowly, the words taking a moment to make sense in her head. Brian stayed a few steps behind, watching silently. Ashley could feel his gaze on her, the gaze that saw her, understood her, and her chest tightened again. She turned to Brian, her voice almost breaking. "So, this is it?" she said, more to herself than to him. Brian gave a half smile, that sad smile she knew she would never forget. "You've got a world waiting for you, Ashley," he said, with a calmness that didn't match the sorrow in his eyes. Ashley swallowed hard. "I don't even know if it's my world anymore," she murmured. Brian didn't answer. He just took off his cap and ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture that said all the things he didn't dare put into words. The men started organizing paperwork and prepping the jet. Ashley knew she had to move, say something, do something. But she stood there frozen between two worlds, the one she knew and the one she had just discovered. She started, but her voice gave out. Brian looked at her with tenderness, but also with the resignation of someone who knows that sometimes wanting isn't enough. "You're gonna be fine, princess," he said, using the nickname with such affection it made her heart ache. Ashley took an impulsive step toward him. "Brian," she whispered. He smiled sadly. "Go live your dream, Ashley. Don't look back." Ashley blinked. trying to fight back the tears threatening to fall. The men called out again, impatient. "Miss Collins, we need to leave in a few minutes." She looked at the jet, then at Brian. Everything inside her screamed to stay, but everything outside her pushed her to go. With one last look, filled with everything they hadn't said, Ashley turned and walked slowly toward the jet. Each step was harder than the last. She climbed the small set of stairs, turned at the door, and for one last moment, found Brian's eyes. And then the world pulled her inside. The door closed. The engine roared. The jet began taxiing slowly across the dirt runway. Brian stood there, hands deep in his pockets, crumpled cap in hand, watching until the jet lifted into the Cedarville sky, a shining speck that eventually disappeared. Only when the jet became just a memory on the horizon did Brian finally let out the breath he'd been holding. And he walked back into the empty hangar, where the smell of grease and the echoes of her laughter still lingered like the ghosts of a dream almost lived. Ashley sat in the silent jet, her seatbelt fastened automatically, her empty gaze fixed on the window. The sky outside was a perfect blue, but inside her, everything felt gray. The flight attendants spoke softly, the engines purred, and the onboard screens displayed the route back to Los Angeles. But Ashley didn't see any of it. Her mind was thousands of miles away, in a simple hangar, surrounded by scattered tools, the smell of burnt oil, and a smile that now seemed as distant as the stars. She wiped a hand across her face, feeling the weight of the tears she was barely holding back. What was she doing? For years she had believed she knew what she wanted. Fame, recognition, contracts, luxury. But now, for the first time, she could see the truth with brutal clarity. None of it meant anything without someone to share it with. Without someone who saw her the way Brian did. Without someone who made her laugh at herself, who taught her that happiness could be a park bench, a slice of apple pie, a pair of cardboard wings. Ashley squeezed her eyes shut, remembering Lucy twirling down the runway with her silver-painted wings, remembering Brian, holding her hand so gently, remembering how her chest had felt lighter, more alive, in Cedarville than it ever had on any red carpet. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Ashley opened her designer bag and pulled out her phone. 52 unread messages, 14 missed calls, 3 pending contracts. The old world was waiting for her with open arms and golden handcuffs. Ashley looked out the window, the jet slicing through the clouds. And then, suddenly, without thinking twice, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. "Miss Collins?" a flight attendant asked, alarmed. Ashley turned to her, her heart pounding, the decision burning through her veins. "I need to go back," she said. "Go back?" The flight attendant repeated, confused. "Yes," Ashley answered with a conviction that even surprised herself. "I need to go back to Cedarville." The flight attendant exchanged a look with the pilot, who appeared at the cockpit door. "Miss, the flight is en route to Los Angeles. We can only turn back in case of an emergency." Ashley took a deep breath. "Then consider this a hard emergency," she said, flashing a determined smile. The pilot hesitated, then sighed. "All right, we'll turn around, but you'll have to explain it to the control tower." Ashley just smiled, feeling an immense weight lift off her shoulders. As the jet made a slow, graceful turn in the sky, she looked out the window again. Down there, somewhere between the golden hills and dusty runways, was everything that really mattered. It wasn't about contracts or schedules anymore. It was about finding where her heart truly wanted to land. And this time, she wasn't going to let it slip away. The jet touched down once again on Cedarville's tiny airstrip under the setting sun. Everything bathed in gold and red. Ashley hurried down the steps, the soles of her sneakers. Yes, she was wearing sneakers now. Pounding against the dirt runway, her heart hammered in her chest, as if it knew that what came next was more important than any runway or red carpet. The airport was almost empty. Old Jack sat in his rocking chair, scratching his chin and looking surprised to see her reappear. "Thought you flew off for good, young lady," he said. Ashley smiled, breathless. "So did I," she replied before rushing toward the hangar. When she got there, Brian was inside, just like always, with his back to the entrance working on an old engine. Ashley stopped at the doorway for a moment, watching him, the way he moved, the quiet focus in everything he did. the simplicity that now seemed like the most precious thing in the world. "Brian," she called out, her voice trembling. He turned around, and for a moment his eyes showed first surprise, then hope, and finally something that made her heart nearly stop: pure emotion. Ashley took a few quick steps toward him. "I came back," she said, as if that explained everything. Brian set the tool down on the bench, his eyes locked on her. "I thought you—" He started, but his voice broke. Ashley shook her head, tears shining in her eyes. "I was going to," she said, giving him a trembling smile. "I was going to go back to my old life, to the commitments, the parties, the contracts, but—" She took another step closer. "None of those places are home. None of those faces are my home." Brian took a deep breath, fighting against the wave of feelings that threatened to overflow. Ashley stopped so close he could feel her warmth. "Here," she said, placing her hand on his chest, feeling his heart pounding under her fingers. "Here's where I want to be." Brian closed his eyes for a moment, like he was etching that moment into his soul. When he opened them again, he smiled, a smile so full of love that Ashley felt the tears roll down her cheeks. "Are you sure?" he whispered. She smiled back, shining through her tears. "I've never been so sure of anything in my life." Brian didn't wait any longer. With a quick, emotion-filled movement, he pulled Ashley into his arms and kissed her. A kiss that was promises and confessions, fears and courage, pain and healing. A kiss that was everything they had almost had, and everything they had finally earned. Ashley clung to him like he was both her anchor and her wings at the same time. And Brian held her like she was the dream he had sketched in his old notebooks, a dream that, against all odds, had just landed right in the middle of his heart. When they finally pulled apart, still breathless and grinning like fools, Brian pressed his forehead against hers. "Welcome home, princess," he whispered. Ashley laughed through her tears. "I finally found my place." And there, in the golden dust of a Cedarville sunset, among forgotten tools and sleeping airplanes, they began building a new dream. This time, together. A few months later, Cedarville bloomed under the spring sun, and the little airport had come back to life. The once worn-out silent hangar was now vibrant, not just from the new tools and fresh paint, but because there was laughter, soft music, and the smell of fresh coffee in the air. Ashley sat on the makeshift porch of the hangar, her bare feet swinging, a laptop open on her lap. She was still an influencer, sure, but now her posts showed golden fields, lazy afternoons, kids running barefoot, and the shy smiling mechanic who had stolen her heart. She had traded runways for dirt roads, luxury hotels for homemade cakes, and oppressive contracts for freedom. And not for a second had she ever regretted it. Brian stepped out of the hangar, wiping his hands on a rag, that same smile lighting up his face. "Hard work or online spying?" he teased, nodding at the laptop. Ashley closed the computer and smiled. "Just showing the world what it's like to really live." Brian sat down next to her, pulling her close. "And the pink jet?" he teased, kissing her shoulder lightly. Ashley laughed. "Sold it. Seriously?" He raised his eyebrows, surprised. "Yeah," she said, shrugging. "I don't need it anymore. I already landed where I really wanted to be." Brian pulled her into a quick, sweet kiss. In the distance, Lucy ran across the makeshift runway, still with her cardboard wings, now reinforced with duct tape and painted even more carefully. Ashley watched the little girl spin and laugh, her heart overflowing with happiness. She turned to Brian and smiled. "You know what?" she asked playfully. "Know what? That you were gonna fix more than just my jet?" Brian let out a soft chuckle and looked up at the clear sky above them. "I think we both needed a little fixing." Ashley nestled against his chest, closing her eyes. And there, at the small Cedarville airport, where life was measured by sunsets and genuine smiles, she knew. She didn't need fake wings anymore, because for the first time in her life she was exactly where she wanted to be, and she would never need to leave again.